people with criminal records as well. Joining us to discuss this further is human rights lawyer Kelly Stone in our Cape Town studio for us. Kelly, a very good evening to you, and thanks for your time this evening. Why do all of these people believe that the death penalty is the answer to this crisis?
Well, sometimes I often think that the death penalty or the call to arms is sort of a visceral response to our collective anger at the lack of sort of response from the state to take this issue seriously, and sort of general frustration about nothing really changing when we look at levels of violence against women that have continued to sort of increase and really operate without impunity. So really the call to bring back the death penalty, I think, is kind of an urgent, it's an urgent call for arms, but in my opinion, it's visceral and short-sighted and ultimately won't achieve what we would like it to achieve.
So what will achieve what we want? I mean, firstly, finding these perpetrators, if we look at just the list recently, we were talking about UCT student Uyinene Mkhwetjana, we're talking about Jesse Hess, we're talking about Leandra Babili Yechels, and also we're talking about, Lynette Folshenk, and brutal killings. And we often use the word, the term brutal, and it's so loosely used, but in these cases they were brutal. They were meant to cause these women pain. So where do we start? I mean, the death penalty, like you say, yes, we might be overreaching. So what do we do to make people afraid to attack our women?
Right. Well, we have to look at really what are the underlying drivers of violence against women, and then that really needs to sort of inform what our collective response is. We see in countries all over the world that have abolished the death penalty because we know it's an ineffective deterrent to all types of crime, including violent crime, including crime against women and children. In the United States, 29 states still have the death penalty. And of those 29 states, they have homicide rates that are that range from 48% to 101% higher than states without the death penalty. So we know it's an ineffective deterrent to crime. So what works? Well, one, I think we need to look specifically at the context of South Africa and the unique sort of history and the unique kind of current dynamic that plays out when we look at violence against women and children. And I think really what's happening here is sort of a collective ignorance of levels of trauma that people experience. The vast majority of perpetrators of violence and rape and murder of women have all been victims themselves. If we look at the life history of each of these perpetrators, there's a very strong chance that we're going to find that they were exposed to significant levels of violence as children, that many of them were victims of violence themselves. And oftentimes when we don't intervene and provide people with the sort of direct interventions that are necessary to disrupt the normalization of violence, to begin to challenge how we normalize violence as a way of communicating, and how we also normalize violence as a way of sort of asserting masculinity and our power over women, we're not going to stop the cycle. So I really believe that in order to really reduce levels of violence against women, it's a all of society responsibility, that we can't just look to the state, we can't just look to the police, we can't just look to the courts, we can't just look to the prison. We need to look to each other. We need to take more collective responsibility of not tolerating any sort of patriarchal norms and violence within our own speech and the way we treat each other. We also need to sort of build in mechanisms that strengthen, increase gender equality in every facet of life and empower our women and girls to hold positions of power. And yeah, I think we really need to do a lot more than we're currently doing.
And Kelly, would that mean also doing thorough background checks on people, on men in certain positions where we hire them, hiring people with criminal records? And therein comes a debate about whether people are rehabilitated, should we give them a second chance? Should we really just become really hard on that and say, listen, absolutely not. If this person has a record or we smell a rat, that they must be gone.
Yeah. So I think that's also another really interesting and contentious issue. So if we look at the law and we look at international norms and standards, and even if we look at the law in South Africa, it's quite clear that there needs to be a causal connection between the nature of the crime and the nature of the job description. Now, in the case of the murder of the UCT student with the post office worker, he had been convicted of armed robbery, which we know is a violent crime, and he had also been charged with rape, which was a case, I believe the charges were withdrawn. It's unclear as to why. But if we actually look at the nature of armed robbery, one, it's a violent crime, and two, it's a crime against a person's property. So there is no reason why he should have been allowed to work at a post office, given his exposure to people's personal information, including their address, their telephone numbers, as well as access to their personal property. Yeah. And then also background checks, in my opinion, should also include any sort of charges that, even if they've been withdrawn, because it's important to know that in cases of sexual assault, they're one of the hardest cases to prove. So just because you don't have a conviction doesn't mean that there isn't a reason to be suspicious. Yeah. So we needed to do much more thorough vetting processes, but I do believe that there shouldn't be a blanket exclusion of people with criminal records, because you can have a criminal record for not paying your traffic fines. Yeah. And you can have a criminal record for urinating in public and not being able to pay. And, you know, if that bars you from being able to have a job for the rest of your life, those are pretty disproportionate and severe consequences. So I really think that we need to look at everything on a case-by-case basis and look to see, is there that causal connection? And in the event, and has the person been rehabilitated? Yeah. Because people, you know, people do possess the potential to be rehabilitated. Yeah.
Okay, well, some mistakes definitely were made in this case, especially in that of the post office employee with that background. Thank you very much for that. That's Dr. Kelly Stone, human rights lawyer. Still to come.